Hey everyone, welcome to the second video where we see how you can go from a local development workflow with Docker Compose to developing on the cloud using the same Docker Compose you have been using with the help of Okteto. In the last video, we explored the sample application we have been working with and saw how we can, make slight changes to our Docker Compose and get this application running on the cloud. Now, the benefits this approach has is that your containers no longer run on the local machine. What this does is it frees up resources and ensures that your local machine is no longer a bottleneck for the application you would be developing. When using this approach of developing on the cloud, all the containers get run in a Kubernetes cluster using cloud resources, so your local machine is not the bottleneck. Another benefit of this approach is that you ensure that you're working in an environment which is like production, because when you use Docker Compose to run containers locally, you know that that's not how things work in production, because you use a container orchestration system like Kubernetes. So we saw in the last video how Okteto translated these Docker Compose services into the relevant Kubernetes deployments, services and resources and ran these things on an actual production cluster. This ensured that our dev environment would exactly be like production so that we don't have any last minute bugs. We also looked at some cool features Okteto provides you, which include being able to have endpoints where you can see your changes live and share them with different teams, whether it be marketing, sales, product, and the benefit is that everyone can give you feedback early on without having the expertise to, build the code or run these containers locally. Developing on Okteto also gives you a way to unify your environments all across the dev lifecycle, so you can ensure that there is consistency in the environment the developers write code in and the environments which you use in production. It also allows you as a platform engineer to govern these environments and gain insights into how many resources are being used by your application or how many namespaces each developer has been using. So in this video, let's see how you can get more control over how developer environments look by creating a manifest called the Okteto Manifest. Now, our app was already working on Okteto with the existing Docker Compose file, but what defining an Okteto Manifest does is it gives you more control and it allows you to precisely, change settings in your dev environment, and we'll soon see what all these settings are. So the first step to that is just creating a manifest called okteto.yaml. So let's just create that file here. Once you have created the file, go to the documentation and see the reference for the Okteto Manifest. This is where you'll start to see all the things you can control in your dev environment. You can define init containers, you can forward extra ports, you can add persistent volumes, you can define resources, external resources, like if you want S3 buckets to be provisioned as part of your dev environments or any other cloud resources for that matter. Now, we won't be going into the detail of all these features, but I will be giving you a brief of what the Okteto Manifest is and how you can get started with it. The Okteto Manifest essentially consists of three sections, which are the build, deploy, and dev. Let's understand each of them in the context of our application. Let's copy the build section and paste it in our Okteto Manifest. What the build section does is basically it tells Okteto how to build your application images. Now this is important because you want to be building the latest container images instead of pulling them from a Docker Hub or some other repository, because they might have been pushed a week or a month ago, but you on the other hand want your developers to be able to work in an environment which has the latest code, so the images need to be built from the latest code. So in our case, we have two services, which are the client and the server. So we just define the name of the services here, and then we give them the context, and the context is basically the folder where the Docker file lives. And for us, you can see that there's a Docker file in the client folder, and similarly there is a Docker file in the server folder, so we add those. The second section in the Okteto Manifest is the deploy section, and this tells Okteto how to deploy your application. So in our case, we want to use our Docker Compose file to deploy our application. So we'll specify the compose key and then mention the file, which is dockercompose.yaml. Now this deploy section is where you can add additional things you want to deploy. So if you want to add external resources like S3 buckets, or if your app is already using Kubernetes manifest or some other things, you can mention them in this section. This is what Okteto, the commands you list here are what Okteto will run when you run Okteto deploy or go ahead and deploy from the UI. The final section is the dev section, and this is where you can, fine tune how your dev environment looks and how your dev containers behave. Now we'll go to the documentation and copy a sample reference for this dev section and edit it along for our application. So we have two services which we named server and client. So let's replace these names with the ones we have been using. The command you see is actually the command which will run when you do Okteto up in the container. So for our server container, bash is fine. But if you remember when we were using just Docker Compose without the Okteto YAML, for our client also we were running bash, and then we had to, manually start our application. But if you change this to something like npm start, so whenever you do Okteto up, this command would already be running for you, and then you developers would have to do even less configuration to get started. Now you can forward ports from the dev container to your local machine, and you can also do the reverse, forward ports from the local machine to the dev container using the reverse key. And we won't be going into this, but this is useful when you want to send a service running locally to your application, or forwarding ports from the application to the local machine is useful when you want to add debuggers or something. But for now, let's remove them. Sync section is basically where you tell what local folder you want to be synced with the code running in the container. So this is where the file synchronization happens, which we saw in the last video. And for us, we want the server folder to get synced with the folder where we copy our code in when we build our container. So we can see that in the Docker file, and we can see that it is /app. So that's what we are going to use here. Similarly, this would be the client directory, and I think the folder is the same for this one as well, /app. So we let that be. And this was it. This is how simple defining an Okteto manifest for your applications really is. Once you have your Okteto manifest defined, you can run Okteto deploy, and this would deploy the application to the Okteto instance URL you must have specified earlier. And we can see that the deployment process has already started. Let's wait for this to finish and we'll see what we see in the UI. Awesome. You'll see that once the application is done deploying, we can go to our Okteto instance and see that we have the relevant Kubernetes services and deployments created for us. We can visit any one of these endpoints and test out our application, and we'll see that it is working as expected. And now when developers want to get started with developing their application, what they can do is run Okteto up like we saw in the previous video, and they will be presented with a list of services. The only difference is that defining an Okteto manifest allowed us to fine-tune this behavior. So if you remember in the last video, when we selected the client service, we just got a simple bash terminal, whereas in this case we would have a terminal where the npm start command would already be running. So that's one thing less developers have to worry about. Similarly, there's a lot of other useful things you can define, like we were talking about earlier, forwarding ports for debuggers or transferring locally running services to the cloud, but setting up init containers, even setting up different images for this container, dev container, where we get the terminal. So you could have an image where you have certain dev tools installed which developers would need when developing that particular application. So this is all the benefits you get when you choose to define an Okteto manifest alongside a Docker Compose file, and therefore you are able to take your dev environment to the next level. So here you'll see that our server is now up and running, and if we go back, the React application is working. So let's make a change in our application and again change the name of the application to something like to-do list. Hit save and we'll see that our application code got compiled again. We go here, refresh, and everything is working just like it was earlier, except now we were able to define things in a much better way and have even a separation of concerns, because this way you can have your Docker Compose file look like it was already, without having to modify it that much. Instead of defining or forwarding ports on the Docker Compose file, you can do all of that dev configuration in a separate file, ensuring that there is a separation of concerns and you do not have to worry about things in one same place. Another benefit of defining Okteto Manifest is that now you can leverage other useful features of Okteto, like Okteto Catalog. Let's see what that is, but to leverage that, what we'll need to do is let's shut this down first and bring down the dev container for the client service, and we'll commit our code so that we know that our application has an Okteto Manifest. So So once we have done that, what we can do is configure a catalog for our developers. And what a catalog basically is, it allows developers to just click this launch dev environment button and choose an application where you have configured everything for them, including what branch, what environment variables and everything, instead of them having to run Okteto deploy or something like that. So to do that, you will first need to be having admin permissions for your Okteto instance, but once you have them, go to the admin section and go to catalog and add a new item. Let's call this Docker Compose Okteto 2, and for the repository URL we'll have the repo URL, and the branch we want to deploy for this one is the branch which has the Okteto Manifest. So I'm gonna copy that name and paste that here. Now you don't need to add this path if the Okteto YAML lives at the root of the repository, which it does for our case. And this is where you can add any variables you might be referencing in your Okteto manifest. Now I won't be going into too much detail here, but you can read more about this in our documentation and you will see a link on the screen somewhere. But once you have that done, you can easily just hit save. And now when we go to our application, any developer can go to a namespace, and when they click launch dev environment, they'll see this application already configured for them. This ensures they do not have to do anything. They just have to log into their instance, click here, change the defined variables if they want to, but essentially just click launch and the environment will get spun up for them. And all of this would happen on the cloud resources. Nothing is happening locally, like the container images are not being built locally, or none of these processes are being run locally. So let's just wait for this to run and then we'll see this in action. Once this is done deploying, you'll see that everything is just like it was when we ran Okteto deploy. The application is up and running and everything is working as expected. So this was it for this video. I hope you found it useful. What we learned was how you can create an Okteto manifest, what an Okteto manifest is, and what benefits you get from using an Okteto manifest with your applications. We didn't go into detail of all the settings you can configure in your Okteto manifest, but if you want to look into those, the documentation is a very good place to go to. Then we also looked into Okteto Catalog, which is basically a way for you to provide your developers with a list of applications they can choose from for easy deployment with having everything configured. If you want to read more about the catalog, you can again go to the documentation and see what else you can configure there. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video useful, and I'll see you in the next one.